It was new and it was contemporaneous with the rise of fascism. I mean, for Christ's sake, like, not just Triumph of the Will, Birth of a Nation
Oh, I know.
is a canonical, like, really important milestone in the development of cinema as a medium. Is the fact that it's a white redeemer racist film accidental?
The Alternative to Genocide by Cutrone. The alternative to extermination is slavery, labor. The only reason for conquerors not to kill the defeated is to put them to work, to make them useful. If they cease to be useful or prove to be more trouble than they are worth, they will be killed. That is the lesson of history. The Keynesian economist Joan Robinson famously said that the misery of being exploited by capitalists is nothing compared to the misery of not being exploited at all. The terrorism of the Second Intifada from 2000 to 2005 brought an end to Palestinian labor in Israel. Not entirely, but substantially, the Palestinians became disposable. That was actually the end. We have been living in its aftermath for the past quarter of a century. It is coming to a conclusion now. Hamas was elected, and that election is coming to fruition. October 7th was a no-turning-back moment for Israel. Palestinian terrorism is to be utterly crushed in a way that has never been attempted previously. It will succeed. The only alternative to this will in fact be genocide. Not rhetorically, but literally. Let us hope it doesn't come to that. Hamas calls the Palestinians a nation of martyrs. Palestinian activists loudly proclaim that they will never surrender. It's easy for them to say. In the meantime, mere survival will demand otherwise. The Palestinians will work, or they will die. They will work. Before October 7th, there was a modus vivendi in which Israel allowed tens of thousands of Gazans to work in Israel, supporting their families back home, tens of thousands more. After October 7th, tens of thousands have been killed, with further tens of thousands grievously wounded. Hundreds of thousands more are left bereft. Israel is teaching a horrifying lesson, and it is the lesson of the modern world, if not for all of history. It is a lesson not worth the teaching, because it is already known by everyone, at least by every worker. The alternative to labor, slavery, is extermination. What does Marxism have to say about that? What doesn't Marxism have to say about it? Nothing and everything. But the point is not Marxism, but socialism. And for Marxism, that means the working class. Tens of thousands of Palestinian workers in Israel and abroad. What do they have to do with socialism? They are the only ones, in fact, to have anything to do with socialism. Not upper or middle class or social climber radicals, not nationalists or Islamists, workers. What they can and should do will decide socialism, or not. Perhaps not today or tomorrow, but the next day. Palestinian workers should have gone to the Israeli kibbutzim, not for hostile reconnaissance, but labor solidarity, to work alongside Israelis and others, not target them for killing, as before October 7th. Hamas killed that possibility, the only possibility for socialism, in Palestine and everywhere. Hamas recruits from the otherwise unemployed and unemployable, angry young men. It seeks not workers, but soldiers, as with any gangsters. It does no good to point out that the same is true of the IDF. Israel is a state with compulsory conscription. Palestine is not. That's the point. But Palestinians don't need a state, and Israelis must overcome the need for theirs. This is not what Hamas wants. Hamas wants war. Hamas wants to be the state, and states mean wars. But the war is over, for a long time now. A Palestinian state is either impossible or undesirable for the workers, but it is what Hamas might be getting them. The Israeli state is the Palestinian state, and the state means violence, whether by Hamas or the IDF, the official or unofficial state, the state of war. The Palestinians are a conquered people, perhaps not for all time, but at least for now. This is not going to change. No amount of protest will change it. This is the reality. The only alternative to extermination is slavery. The only alternative to living with defeat is not living with it, dying from it. But there is an alternative to death. Life. Life as a worker. It is actually preferable to death. Every worker knows this. Pick your battles and live to fight another day. But Hamas denied Palestinians this option, purposefully. If they cannot be lords, then there will be no subjects. Only there are. Will they be allowed to live? Or will their defeated lords demand their death to honor them? The idea of a noble death is an aristocratic one. Perhaps it is also virtuous for priests. The point is that it is not for the people to die nobly. The people can only die miserably. This is what makes them ignoble and dishonorable, clinging to bare life at all cost, no matter the compromise of virtues. Good. What does Marxism have to say about that? It does not promise redemption, but only possible change in mode of production, an exchange of miseries. And not out of morality, but history, objective necessity. The only good is life itself, and the only change that is possible is in how the good of life is to be achieved. There is no objective reason for an end to suffering, but only for transforming its necessity. Marxism is resolutely materialistic, placing happiness as the goal in the struggle for freedom, not principle. Marx wrote his dissertation on Epicurus and Democritus. Marx was a democratic Epicurean. This is what is called socialism. Communism seems nobler, which is why Marx criticized it. Marx was not interested in the subjective communism of intellectuals, but the objective communism of workers. Will they have it? Marx found in communism the scent of religion, and not from the rose and the cross, but something baser and meaner in the odor of priests and nuns wafting out of the cloister, the academy. What are the children doing in their tents but practicing their religion? It is best kept out of sight. The alternative to genocide is the working class struggle for socialism. Short of that, it is the struggle of the workers to survive in capitalism, and perhaps of intellectuals to abandon their illusions, whether in communism or whatever else, their sentimental projections onto the workers, who they can only value in their misery and wretchedness of victimhood, the direr the better. But that is their psychology. Don't listen to the priests or shamans or holy fools, for they are false prophets. The world is not ending. Nietzsche was right about the priests tricking not only the nobles but the slaves into an evil resentment for tearing down the good. Thankfully, this was never so successful and was mostly ignored, confined to the middle class of Nietzsche's own bourgeois milieu, that of today's enraged protesters. Nietzsche was right about them. Nietzsche was right. It is in fact necessary to surrender to your boss. It is not just, but necessary. Necessary to live. Workers are not privileged to do otherwise. They are not bosses, nor do they want to be. They just want to live. Shall we let them? Or do we demand their sacrifice to our crazed ideas? Thankfully, they are not listening. Only the bosses are listening. Be careful not to make the worker's life harder in order to satisfy your own perverse desires and deranged visions.
Who's attracted to the monastery?
A variety of people. It would be like who's attracted to poetry or who's attracted to art.
Keep them where they belong, in the monastery or nunnery. Get thee there, and stay put in your chosen torture chamber for the measurement of souls. Or else, a healthy dose of Philistinism would be salutary. The intellectuals need to get a job, make themselves useful in their labor. They can start by stopping their preaching of extermination as the only alternative to slavery. They can stop preaching genocide, which doesn't help anyone but themselves. It doesn't save anyone but their own beautiful souls, which the world can actually do without, thank you. What the world cannot do without is the people sacrificed to the worshipping of false idols, including those of true religions. Let us not have a democide. Let the people struggle for socialism. Let them work. There is an alternative to genocide.
It is a kind of direct perception, unfettered by common sense. It is not mere laziness. It is rather a kind of active sloth. Slack in its pure form makes happiness seem like agony by comparison. Next to slack, the nirvana known to mystics and saints is like endless torment. Slack is different for each person. One might call it something for nothing. But the normals, the mediocritans, the somnambulacs, and pseudo-subslans have tried to make it something which we have been led to believe we must work to buy. It is this yearning for slack that separates us from the normals. The human may live out his entire life in a grinding cycle of slacklessness, his hours consumed by meaningless toil, interspersed with meaningless leisure. Yet he never feels cheated. He thinks it is natural. Perhaps we should pity them, but face it, most people are venal jerks, half-witted cattle, racing each other to be first to the slaughterhouse, and stampeding you along with them.
Welcome back to the Cutrone Zone. It's that time of the week again. I'm glad to be talking to you, Chris. You just sent me, before we started recording, an essay that's going to be in Sublation magazine sometime soon. We haven't set a date yet, but it's called An Alternative to Genocide. And it is a provocation, I would say. There are lots of little ways that you, in the piece, where you say things that can certainly be read the wrong way and that require the reader to stay with the text and hear the next line in order to understand what you're actually saying. But do you want to lay out, first of all, what the message of An Alternative to Genocide is, and then also maybe why you wrote it the way you did? I'll start with those questions.
Okay, so I've been troubled by the terror of the situation with respect to Israel-Palestine, which we should point out was the goal. Like, it was Hamas's goal to produce a situation of terror. That's what terrorism means. And it has succeeded. I'm terrified. Everyone's terrified. And, we are, terrified by the specter of genocide. I've argued, as I already published in my Israel-Palestine on the Left article, that I don't think it's a genocide, and I don't think it's useful to call it a genocide. And that, I invoked Adorno to say perhaps we should throw out the whole concept of genocide as inherently ambiguous and hypocritical. But, again, I am aware of the fact that this is plausible, and not just plausible as a concrete empirical reality, but plausible as a characterization. And, I'm reminded of something that Frederick Jameson said many years ago, which is that for Marx, it looked like history was the history of class struggle, but today it looks like history is the history of genocide. And to take that up kind of actively and try to sneak in a little bit of, Marxism, because obviously that's a very non-Marxist view to say that history is the history of genocide. To say that history is the history of modes of production, and the history of modes of production is the history of class struggle, is already kind of a conceptual leap. It's kind of going out on the edge, like it is Marx's perverse Hegelianism. It's not nearly as straightforward as people think. But to say history is the history of genocide just seems extremely brutally straightforward. And to try to take that up and to just say, okay, if history is the history of genocide, and if the present is showing that, then what do we do with it? What do we do about it? Take it up in its own terms in that respect. And so, the thesis statement is the alternative to extermination is slavery. Slavery is better than extermination.
Right. So just to clarify in my own way what you're saying about, the difference between the history being a history of genocide and history being the history of class struggle is, from my way of thinking, is if you say that history is a history of genocide, what you're saying is, one thing I think you're saying is that the world is filled up with the things that we need, and we go around killing one another to steal from one another to the things that one tribe has or that another tribe has. So you're kind of there's a natural inheritance that one ethnic group might have, and another ethnic group will come in and take it from them, kill them all. That's one way to think of it. The land, but also maybe their culture, or their gold, or their minerals, or whatever, right? And the Marxist view is, no, actually, cooperation is built into human society, and what the class struggle is about how we cooperate and to build the world together. So there's both oppression and cooperation in the way the world is created and the way wealth is created. So when there's a war, it's not necessarily a war of simply like stealing things, but also about political control and changing maybe the structure of society and how it reproduces itself. Would that be accurate?
And that would be, a kind of retrospective bourgeois view. In other words, to say that history is the history of cooperation. Again, modes of production, the way we've cooperated. And maybe the way we have cooperated has entailed class formations, right? But, I think there's a darker view, because I think, Doug, if you say that humans have always fought with each other over natural resources, and perhaps even over cultural resources, that ignores maybe that they weren't necessarily fighting over land. They were just fighting each other. When the Persians, the Battle of the 300, Sparta, we are Spartans, Gerard Butler, are they fighting over land, or are they just fighting each other? Right? Like, in other words, it seems like, okay, people encounter each other and they're just going to fight. It's like a very warrior view of the world. I'm just aware of the fact, and this is really the point of my article, is that if you have a working class view, you're always going to choose slavery over extermination. It's a ruling class view that says, oh, death before dishonor, or, give me liberty or give me death. Understood, especially in nationalistic or culturalistic terms, it's like, and I point out, look, it's like, never surrender. It's like, well, that's easy for people of the ruling class to say. But the workers have to surrender all the time. You have to surrender to a boss to live. So like, never surrender, that's a ruling class perspective. Let's just be honest about that. And so, right? And I just, I feel like, oh, I have too much pride to like work a job. Well, yeah, if you can afford to have that much pride. But if you're a working person, you can't have that much pride. You know what I mean? It's like, come on. And so, who has decided that the Palestinians should die? Hamas, right? They're the death before dishonor people. They're the people who are putting. Sure, I mean the Zionists are also that. Absolutely, like no doubt, right? I'm not saying that Israel doesn't have that. It does, right? But you know, presumably, what we're talking about, if we're in the world of Palestinian solidarity, right? If we're in the world of caring about the plight of the Palestinians, then the question is, what is to be done? And is the only alternative death before dishonor? Let's hope not. Let's hope not, right? And also, what's meant by freedom, right? So, this is big in my understanding of modernity, capitalism, bourgeois society, Marxism. Aristotelian freedom is the freedom to be what you are. You know, but that is again Aristotle. That's a ruling class perspective. Modern freedom, the freedom to change, the freedom to become, the freedom to transform, not the freedom to uphold your culture, you know? And, again, it's like, I always point out, like, the Reconquista, you know? Talking about like Christianity and Islam, and, it happens around the same time as the Columbian discovery of the Western Hemisphere. And who's expelled when they expel the Muslims from Spain? It's not the peasants. They don't expel all the peasants. They don't. They expel the nobles and the imams, the priests. They expel the ruling castes. They expel the Muslim ruling classes. They don't expel the peasants. No. So the peasants were ruled by Muslims, and then the next day they're ruled by Christians. But the peasants are still there. They don't care that much because they don't really do strict Islam and they don't really do strict Christianity. They do some syncretic Mediterranean hodgepodge of folk beliefs, right? Until the modern world where you can get on the internet and be put straight as to what actual Islam is, or what actual Christianity is. Like there's a Bible study guide on YouTube you can tune into in order to get your Christianity straight, right? But for thousands of years, the peasants just have whatever. They have whatever folk religion. They don't have like the official religion. They're not going to kill anyone or die over like scriptural interpretation. That's what the priests do. They love to kill each other and torture each other over how to read scripture. The peasants? Well, first of all, they can't read. Thank God. Right? So again, what are we talking about when we're talking about, the Reconquista is the beginning of like European imperialism because look, they kicked out the Muslims. Yeah, they kicked out the Muslim ruling class. The people were still there. The people are always there. And yeah, they're the victims of the ruling class's battles. They always are. But as socialists, as Marxists, shouldn't we take the standpoint of the people, not the standpoint of the rulers? Right? And there is this question of, well, how do you survive? You make yourself useful.
I want to read a line or two from what you was going to be in the Sublation magazine article. You write, Hamas was elected and that election is coming to fruition. And here's the line I really want to read. October 7th was a no turning back moment for Israel. Palestinian terrorism is to be utterly crushed in a way that has never been attempted previously. It will succeed. The only alternative to this will will in fact be genocide, not rhetorically, but literally. Let us hope it doesn't come to that. All right, so this is one of those paragraphs where you can be misread. Okay.
Uh-huh. Oh, it's
Um,
saying that this is a good thing or something.
well,
No.
what do you mean by the alternative to Palestinian terrorism being crushed is genocide? Do you mean that either Hamas will be defeated or all of the Palestinians will be killed, or
Possibly. Or kicked out or something, right? So if the fear is, because again, if we use the United Nations definition of genocide, then it doesn't have to be the extermination of every last person. It can also be their expulsion. Right? It's the destruction of a people living in a place. So, it is a democide. That's a word that I use, a democide, right? So genocide implies like the genome is being extinguished, right? But let's call it, according to the UN definition, it's not really a genocide, it's a democide. It's the destruction of a people in whole or in part. And that can include, quote unquote, cultural genocide, but also ethnic cleansing, territorial displacement. Right? It's the destruction of a people's way of life. It's a destruction of a community. That's what it really is. And, yes, I mean, that might be the result of what Israel is doing. And yes, right? Now, will it mean the extermination of every last Palestinian? No, it won't mean that. But it might mean a democide.
Okay. So I wanted to clarify
Right.
that. And why do you think October 7th was a no turning back moment for Israel? Are you just saying that retrospectively, looking at what actually happened, or?
I think they decided.
Yeah.
I think Israel, I think it's clear. I think they announced it, right? And this is what
Right.
freaked everyone out. I mean, I think the basic point about the Gaza war, what's going on, is that I think the October 7th attack frightened the people sympathetic to Palestinians. Meaning they were like, oh, what's going to be the Israeli response? And so immediately they had to say, oh, yes, the October 7th attack happened, but history didn't begin on October 7th. And it's 75 years, right? And, there's a whole backstory. And no, Hamas didn't start it. Israel started it back in 1948, or the Balfour Declaration, or Zionism, Theodore Herzl, right? Israel started it. So no, it's not, nothing Israel does now is a response to October 7th. It's just an ongoing attack by Israel. And the October 7th attack was just resistance.
Right.
To a ceaseless attack by the Zionists against the Palestinians. That is the vision of, but they know that that's not entirely true. In other words, they know that this was not happening before October 7th.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
So then it's like, oh, it was a slow motion genocide. It was an open air concentration camp. And obviously a concentration camp is where people are genocided. Right? And so, but I think that really what people were freaked out by is like, holy shit, Israel's really going to do something in response to this. And that's what this whole thing has been about, the protest movement. Insofar as it's about this, it might also be involved with other discontents in society that are being focused through this symbolically. But leaving aside that, insofar as it's actually about this war, what is it really about? It's about the sense of foreboding dread that this is some kind of end for the Palestinians, that the Hamas attack is going to precipitate the final solution for the Palestinians by the Israelis. And so, again, I don't think that that's actually the case. I don't think that's possible. I also don't think that it's desirable. I don't think that Netanyahu wants to do that. Or, I don't think it's really possible to do it. I don't think that they even want to do it. So then what is it? Well, it's definitely, they've decided they're not going to have a modus vivendi with Hamas in Gaza. In other words, they're not going to allow for a return of the status quo. In other words, they're not going to just retaliate they're not going to stop until they've wiped out Hamas in Gaza. They're not going to stop. And it doesn't matter how many collateral casualties there are. They do have a military aim, destruction of Hamas, and they're going to do it no matter what. It's not going to be stopped. They're not going to stop. They're not going to be stopped. No one's going to be able to stop them. They themselves are not going to stop.
Well,
That's
do
it.
you think? I
Right?
mean,
So
okay. So let's stop. Let's pause on that for a moment.
I think this is my opinion. My opinion, and I could be wrong, of course, but my considered judgment is that the U.S. wants them to stop. The U.S. is not in a position to stop them. The U.S. cannot stop them.
Well, I think okay. So Biden just paused a shipment of ammunition.
That won't stop them, though.
Well, it did seem to maybe delay the invasion of Rafah to the full extent that they were planning, or maybe not. They were doing
a limited incursion, and Israel was doing the limited incursion in preparation for the broader attack. And I think they're holding that as a sort of Damocles to try to get the hostages out. Now, what's very interesting, so, people may not be paying attention, but you have to be paying attention. So the CIA director, the director of the CIA is in Cairo. And they themselves, that guy, Burns, I think his name is, wrote the actual agreement that Hamas signed.
Oh.
So, yeah, like literally the US CIA director wrote the agreement and said to Hamas, will you sign this? And Hamas was like, yes. And then Israel said no.
Okay, see, that's confusing because what I heard was that there was a U.S.-Israel terms that they were putting forward, and then there was the Egyptian-Qatar terms that,
No, look it up. The CIA director is involved, so they're in Cairo. The U.S. has a team that's in Cairo, and
no, I know you're right.
They're directly dealing with Hamas right there, and Hamas was like, no. And then the CIA director was like, okay, I'll go back to my hotel room and modify it. And then he came back with a modified version. And they were like, yes. And then Israel was like, oh, no.
Well, right. Okay, so I read Tablet about this, right? And they were saying what you're saying, but that it was a CIA created document, and the U.S. is really trying to put tremendous pressure on Israel to stop, and that this is part of a long-standing pivot away from Israel into Iran. That's Tablet's position, which I think is plausible, not like
there's an aspect of truth to that. There is an aspect of truth to that, but it isn't like either or. I mean, I really like Jacob Siegel's perspective, which is that the U.S. wants to wants all of these countries to be dependent on the U.S.
Right.
Of course they do.
Of course. Right. And so, so but the point that they were making was that that the leftists should take up is that the United States actually does want this to be contained, and they've all been trying to constrain Israel all along.
Yeah, because that's not like people will say, oh, the U.S. is providing diplomatic cover and ideological cover for Israel's genocide. And it's like, I'm sorry, the CIA director, that's not what's going on. I'm sorry, no.
No.
That is not what that is. In other words, he definitely expected to be reaching an agreement.
Right.
He's not just playing games to allow Israel to kill more Palestinians. That is not what's happening.
Right, but they also don't want to appear to the world as if Israel's just giving them the middle finger. Right?
Well, of course not, but that's diplomacy. That's something else. I mean, but that is basically what happened. Right? And of course the U.S. still wants to, the U.S. is not going to burn its bridges with Israel. I mean, the other thing is that obviously the U.S. has been cultivating the opposition in Israel.
Right. Yeah.
And
or was it Hamas cultivating that opposition, Chris? What's the difference between Hamas and the United States?
No, I mean,
no,
it's kidding. The U.S. is going to play all sides of all issues. They're in a
Right.
position to do so. And it's also what's expected of them by all concerned.
Right.
Right? And so that's that. I mean, but in any case, I think that we have clear evidence that Israel will stop when it wants to, not when the US tells it to. I think this last weekend shows, like, if you didn't already know that, this is an unignorable evidence
Right.
that Israel is not working with the US.
What do you make of the fact that the protests in Tel Aviv haven't really been mentioned much by the American left? Like they just, I have not, like, anyway, I have not seen people on Twitter pointing to it in the way they pointed to, like, the Aaron Bushnell who set himself on fire. And, they're not celebrating that.
No, I mean, it's because they're, anti-Zionist, whatever, right? I mean, they're not, I think that they don't have a sense that there is potential opposition in Israel. And, that's the problem, is that, I mean, there are two dimensions to this. So there's obviously political opposition. There are parties competing.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's the people. Now, they might have strings pulled by the parties. They might.
Mm-hmm.
Or they might be influencing the parties.
But no, they obviously do. I mean, that's just always the case.
That's always the case. But, I think that the families of the hostages who are saying, stop the war, we want our family members back, I think that's real. That's a real phenomenon, right? And, so there's like basically a peace faction. And maybe it's small, but it's there.
Right.
And, so that's my vision of what's going on. Mm-hmm. Is that the only thing that will stop Israel is Israel. Meaning it will happen for political reasons within Israel, or it won't happen at all. Right? And so this is where, I want to say that the leader of the opposition, who is also in the war cabinet, he has made clear that he is committed to this operation against Hamas.
Right.
And so,
No, I think that there aren't a lot of options to immediately intervene unless you want to say, okay, the United States should invade Israel on a humanitarian basis, right? I mean, like, unless you want to talk on that level of trying to stop it, which, of course, or China should, or someone should, some bigger power.
I mean, you could call for UN peacekeepers into Gaza. You could.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. You could say, okay, there's going to be a humanitarian intervention into Gaza, and there's going to be, a military force to protect the humanitarian aid that's being put into Gaza. And basically, a defense of the people of Gaza against the Israelis. Yeah. And it might even come to that. I mean, the U.S. is building a pier, right? Mm-hmm. They did this once before in Haiti after the earthquake. They're doing it now for Gaza in order to be able to deliver humanitarian aid very quickly from the sea. And, it's unclear. They might be setting themselves up to be vulnerable to attack by Hamas. So recalls the Beirut barracks bombing by Hezbollah. Right. So the U.S. might put itself in a vulnerable position there. And, there has been some question. So when this operation was initiated, people were saying, oh, is the U.S. going to be drawn into a quagmire? And does Hamas want to do that? Right. So how that might be the case, and maybe they even do, want to drag them into a quagmire, because maybe that would be a way that Hamas can save themselves against the Israelis, is to get the U.S. involved. So there are different ways that this could unfold, in fact.
If you attack the U.S., if Hezbollah attacks the U.S., how would that help Hamas stave off Israeli attacks?
Oh, because you could just say, well, okay, so the U.S. wants to deliver humanitarian aid to the Gazans, and in order to do so, they need to fortify their position on the shore, right? And then they have to establish some kind of perimeter beyond that, from which
Right, and so that would stop the Israelis from being in that
operating,
region.
right?
But
So,
it wouldn't be an actual conflict between the United States and
no,
Israel. Right.
no, and no, it won't ever come to that, right? It won't ever come to that. But I don't think that that's the most likely eventuality.
Yeah.
I think the most likely eventuality is that the fecklessness of the Biden administration will be revealed, and the inability of the United States to stop Israel has already been revealed, and that Israel will just continue its military campaign. And both Hamas and Israel will use negotiations to their tactical advantage, to stall for time, to reposition themselves, to try to win militarily, also using diplomacy as a bluff. Right? And so
Hamas winning militarily is just they managed to survive in the region and not have
in Gaza.
In Gaza.
In Gaza.
Having to flee. Yeah.
Now they are in the West Bank too, but in Gaza they have a military force, and that's what Israel's trying to destroy.
Right.
Right. So the success for them would be that they preserve some basis for their military force in Gaza.
So did you listen to my interview with Electra and Joe from
I did.
What did you make of that?
With the uncommitted campaign.
Yeah, the uncommitted campaign. I thought it was very revealing, actually. I thought it was worth
it was a little bit, I don't know, a little bit hopeless, I think. Meaning that obviously this is a pressure tactic on the Democrats. It is.
Right.
And, it's a threat.
From the Democrats on the Democrats.
Yes, absolutely.
That's how we should think of it. It's not a pressure Democrat on the Democrats from some outside force. These are Democrats.
Right.
A faction is an intra-party conflict around the policy with Israel. That's what this is.
That's right. And it's just, it's not even, again, they might think it's to do something differently, but really it's just to do the same thing but more than what the Biden administration is already doing. And so my sense of the campus protests and of something like the uncommitted movement is that they're banging on an open door, meaning this is what the Biden administration wants to do anyway. So it's not about doing something different. It's about doing the same, but doing it more, trying harder. It's a try harder campaign.
So
try hard.
What do you mean by that? Stop sending ammunition earlier, basically?
Yeah, or maybe, ramp it up. In other words, cut back other kinds of support, other kinds of logistical cooperation. Just put all pressure to bear, maximum pressure campaign on Israel rather than constructive engagement with Israel.
Right. And the assumption in that interview that they both seem to have was that without the United States giving the weapons, that Israel is basically in the same position as Ukraine or something. Not even, once we cut off the weapons and Israel's just done.
Right.
And I was like, but
no, obviously that's not true. No,
Israel sells weapons to Russia. Is selling weapons to Russia.
It might depend on other kinds of considerations, meaning that there might be an idea that it makes Israel more vulnerable to Hezbollah attacking from Lebanon, and maybe more vulnerable to Iranian direct attack, which also just happened, right? And so it's like the Iron Dome and the U.S. Patriot missiles, So the rockets that are lame, but they're not as lame as they used to be. So the rockets are a lot more powerful now than they used to be, and a lot more accurate than they used to be. But the idea is that you could force Israel to shoot down all these more or less lame rockets and leave them vulnerable to more serious rocket attack from higher military grade rockets. In other words, that basically Hamas is shooting chaff from Gaza, which would allow for a serious ballistic missile attack from either Iran or Lebanon.
But Iran, it seemed to me like theater, like they were just.
They did just do that. We talked about that. Yeah, they did just do that, and yet, they could always do more. They could always do otherwise, and that's true of Hezbollah as well. I don't think that it is. So, in other words, the assumption is that yes, Hamas is not going to cause Israel to expend all of its ammunition, but in concert with others, the Houthis, like that you could create a vulnerability for Israel. But again, that assumes something. That assumes that countries are willing to attack or let alone invade Israel to protect the Palestinians. That's not true.
Well, no, that's right.
That's not true. And so it's based on all sorts of assumptions that are just not true. And so, again, like, what do they really want? Yes, they want an end to settler colonialism in the state of Israel. That's not going to happen. What do they really want? An end to the genocide. It's not really a genocide. So what do they really want? They want an end to this military campaign against Hamas. They want an end to the Gaza war. And the U.S. is trying to do that. Obviously, the U.S., like literally day by day, like the U.S., like every single day is trying to stop that war. Hour by hour, minute by minute. They want it finished as soon as possible.
Right.
So it's not like, make it happen faster. They're trying their best to make it happen as quickly as possible. And it's not happening. And that's because I do think, to go back to what you quoted from my article, I do think that Israel is determined to destroy the military capacity of Hamas in Gaza, and they will not stop until they do so.
Right.
In other words, they might try to get some hostages out. It doesn't seem like that's terribly important. Like, I think they've prioritized destroying Hamas militarily to getting the hostages out.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very tricky situation because one of the critiques you might launch at Israel is to say, okay, well, they're kind of fighting it in a cowardly way. That because at the beginning of this is like, no one wanted a ground invasion to be the first move, but if you were really if you were trying to protect the civilian life, what you'd be reduced to is sending maybe special forces or at least ground troops in to go into the tunnels to go and target actual Hamas fighters, which would put the Israeli soldiers in harm's way. Be very, it's like fighting with an arm tied behind your back. But that's sort of, but that would be a way to try to protect the civilians of Gaza, and because it would open up the Israelis to a lot of, make them very vulnerable. Then that's could very well, it would possibly then lead to an escalation anyway, right?
It also might make it more politically untenable in Israel itself. In other words, a lot of Israeli casualties might actually increase the call for peace in Israel.
Right. Well, right. So there's a reason
with this government, especially with this government, because the government's unpopular anyway, Netanyahu, his coalition. And so, I think that the basic point is that every country fights wars in such a way as to minimize its own casualties.
Right.
That's it. That's why, look, if we're going to be in this thousands of years history, like the Holy Land, ancient feuds, religious warfare, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, duking it out, where the world was created. That's the Al-Aqsa Mosque. That's the Wailing Wall. That's the temple. So the Abrahamic religions believe that God created the world and it began there, at that site, right? So then, we're dealing with thousands of years of history. And in thousands of years of history, what can we say? We can say people have conquered each other, and the people who were conquered were either exterminated or enslaved. And
right.
that's
Okay,
what's
let's get back to that.
That's
so
what's
you're
happening
saying,
to the Palestinians.
right.
You know?
So you're saying the better choice between being conquered and exterminated or enslaved would be for them to be enslaved. And
Yep.
and I want to point out that I just had an interview earlier today with Fabio Vighi, and I'm not sure which one's going to come out first. But yours probably will. But in this upcoming interview with Fabio, we talk about how one important way to think about the Palestinians is as lumpen,
Yeah.
right? And as
not even
therefore,
slaves.
right. And basically,
Not
they're
even.
and this is happening more and more across the globe. It's
The
not
world.
just Palestinians,
That's right.
but more and more people are just being
Surplus
made
population.
extraneous. Yes.
Surplus
So
population.
so with a surplus population like that, it's cheaper to exterminate them than to feed them. They're just eaters after all. They're not contributing anything. So they're, if from a conspiracy kind of mind, it's like, oh yeah, capitalism wants them dead. And
I mean, it does and it doesn't, meaning that it's actually pretty cheap to keep people fed and alive. It's not nearly as expensive as we might think. Those of us who are scrambling to survive. Actually, it's no skin off the ass of the ruling class to keep us alive, actually, if they cared to. But again, why should they? In other words, we have to sell, ourselves. We have to make it worth their while. We have to sell them on this idea. Please keep me alive.
Ultimately, when we say it's not very expensive, we just mean the work that's being done is very efficient and productive.
Yeah.
That's what we mean. And so it's, we're feeding ourselves. We're not, the ruling class isn't feeding anybody.
Of course. But you know what I mean. The people who are in a position to allocate resources.
Right.
To say, it's better to pay 5 people to work at Starbucks than to pay for 1 person to work in Silicon Valley.
Right.
No, I mean, it's, again, looked at from the standpoint of the working class. So what I point out is that, look, the Second Intifada, in the article, the Second Intifada brought about an end to Palestinian employment in Israel. And that from my standpoint, that was really the end for the Palestinians. In other words, once the Palestinians were useless to the Israelis, then that's really the end. Now, of course, that's not an absolute situation, not at all, because Palestinians still work in the settlements in the West Bank. And even Hamas, like even the open air concentration camp, let tens of thousands of workers out to work in Israel. So they had a modus vivendi. Israel and Hamas-run Gaza had a modus vivendi in which Israel allowed tens of thousands of workers into Israel, which of course means a lot. Like they're not paid very well. They're not. They're not at all, right? In other words, they're super exploited. But again, this was happening. Well, that certainly is over now. In other words, the October 7th attack, in other words, did the October 7th attack change anything? Right?
It ended that.
It changed that. That's one thing, right? And, because I feel like people, when I say, there should be working class solidarity, we should care about the working class and struggle for socialism, and they're just like, well, this is completely unrealistic, because how can you talk about that in the middle of a genocide? And it's like, well, but wait. Either the genocide was always happening, or it was only happening after October 7th. So if it was only happening after October 7th, but also if there was still Palestinian employment in Israel after the Second Intifada, after the walls went up, that's still remarkable. And I just point out the basic, and I know that people they hate talking about the October 7th attacks, but I'm going to talk about something that cannot be called Hasbara, Israeli propaganda, Zionism. Palestinians working at the kibbutzes that were attacked. The kibbutzes were attacked. Unfortunately, some of the Palestinians who worked there were secretly working for Hamas and were basically gathering intelligence on how to attack these kibbutzes, how to defeat the security system. And it's like, you know what? I'm sorry. No, that's not what the workers should have been doing there. Right? They should have been there to basically demonstrate in practice, in reality, the possibility of cooperation.
Right.
Because now, so no kibbutz is going to hire a Palestinian worker because they might be a spy for the next terrorist attack? What the fuck? Right? So we're supporting that?
Right. I mean,
That's
this brings to mind the whole Nat Turner metaphor, right? That's why you said slavery in here instead of working. It's like you're split between extermination and slavery rather than the real split, which is between ethnic cleansing or displacement and working. But you know, right after the October 7th attacks, Ashley and I did a stream where we came to the conclusion that if what the left should be calling for, even as unrealistic as it might seem, was for Israel to loosen the restrictions on who could work in Israel while trying to destroy Hamas. But I didn't even put that part in, right, actually. But that's just kind of realistically what you probably might be able to pull off politically, and probably not even that. But and I was called a Zionist.
Sure, of course that is. I mean, what I was going to say is, look, this war will end. There will still be Palestinians in Gaza, and they will be employed in Israel. Eventually, this will happen. Right? Eventually. But maybe not in the far, far distant future, like within a number of years, maybe within a number of months. You know? So the point of the matter is that, you know, this is going to be the outcome anyway. I don't think it's going to be extermination. I don't think it's going to be ethnic cleansing. It is not. And so there are going to be Palestinians in Gaza, and they are going to work. They're going to work there. They're going to work abroad. They're going to work, some of them, in Israel. So that's going to continue, right? So what will this war have accomplished for the Palestinians? Nothing.
Not anything. But what I wanted people to get out of the interview that I did with Electra and Dave was how the rhetoric of from the river to the sea, we're siding with the decolonizers, we're going to support Hamas, which was there. Let's not pretend like it didn't. You know, Jody Dean represents people.
Yes.
And that all of that, where that ended up and where that's now ended up is a protest, a very strident, militant protest movement, which, by the way, I support people's right to protest. I'm completely not trying to demonize the protesters, but it ended up with a protest movement, which is really expressing an intra-party conflict, which will end up possibly creating some plausible deniability for the Democrats, so that they can put forward a smarter, better version of exactly what's gotten us here. You know, like Obama. Obama saying, "Oh, I'm not against the war on terror. I just want to fight it. I want to be smarter about how we fight." And so that was my.
I mean, we do have to be, you know, thinking long term, in the sense that it's not about stopping this war. It's about creating conditions for stopping such wars in the future. Meaning, you know, I think that as long as we're in capitalism, this is going to be going on somewhere in the world. It's kind of like do you need to be a Marxist or a socialist or even a particularly radical person to be against these wars? The Ukraine war, the Gaza war? You don't. I mean, obviously, there's a great deal of opposition to these wars that's coming from within the capitalist political system itself. And so is our job to pressure people in that? Do they need that pressure? I mean, maybe they can use that pressure, of course. It's helpful. But is it necessary? In other words, without the campus protests, what would be going on?
Oh, I'm not sure if Biden would have paused the ammunition shipment to Israel or not without the campus protests. I suspect he would have, but I can't say for certain that. Would you think that he would have?
Yes. Yeah. I think that, I mean, I'm just thinking of the fall versus now.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not as if you needed these campus protests. There was already a great deal of, motivation by the Biden administration.
Mm-hmm.
And when did you have that interview with Jacob Siegel about?
Oh, a few days, like maybe a week or so after October 7th. It was, a little bit into the invasion of Gaza.
Right, but it was early on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet this was already there.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that. So I look at it. Are the campus protests going to affect policy? No. So what are they doing? And we're back to what we've talked about before, the miseducation of Rashida Tlaib.
Mm-hmm.
We're miseducating a new generation.
Oh, yeah.
And that's what they're accomplishing, and that's why I might be against the protests. I'm not against the right to protest, but I'm also not encouraged by the protest. I don't think the protests are necessarily a good thing. Yes, people are upset. They need to vent. They need to express themselves. Fine.
Mm-hmm.
People will protest. Fine. But do I think it's good for, what I'm interested in? The struggle for socialism?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think so. Because I think it represents a real setback, actually. It's definitely like, Jay Sakai settlers, land back, like the ideology here is, I think, counterproductive. It's anti-Americanism. It's your usual,
Mm-hmm.
third worldism, romance. It's some kind of like anti-U.S. imperialism. And, everyone who's against U.S. imperialism is objectively doing something progressive and good, and that's somehow serving the long-term goal of socialism. No, I don't think so. And it's actually, it is miseducating people who are probably more or less useless anyway, meaning the elite PMC in training, But there might be a handful of them that might have been useful for the struggle for socialism. I mean, I'll just comment, the DSA, Jacobin, that milieu, they're largely standing aside of this stuff. They're waiting. They're biding their time because, who's really active? The Stalinists.
Well, the DSA, one of the two people I was talking to was a DSA member, in that interview.
Mm-hmm. But the core Bhaskar Sankara type people, the Ben Burgess type people, they're not all in with the protests or something. No.
What I would say is that the DSA Jacobin line is, of course, the protesters should be supported. And,
sure.
Right.
But this land back stuff, they don't support all that.
And this is a genocide. But they won't go to the ethno-nationalist justifications.
Right.
Right. But the
Ben Burgess's article that people's rights should not depend on where they were born, was seen as Zionism.
Right, I know. That's crazy. But
But
seem
no, that's the world that we're living in. That's why I'm saying the DSA is not all in on this. Ideologically,
Right.
I'm talking about ideologically.
Yeah,
Like,
right.
look, I mean, the Biden administration is doing what can be done. In other words, the best possible outcome is already being pursued by the U.S. government. And so, if the protests are serving that, then how can you, like what it's not like I'm like, oh no, Biden should be supporting Israel to the max. No, of course not. That's not the point, right? So
Right.
again,
No,
we have to be clear about like what is actually going on, like what's really going on, what's the dynamics here, and and I just feel like, well, what's really happening is Biden is being embarrassed, and this is contributing to the election of Trump.
Right. I mean, I don't think it's actually going to be decisive. I mean, I think it was already kind of written.
But it's sort of, Law and Order. It's Nixon 1968.
Yeah.
It's I was watching an interview with one of the janitors who was briefly detained and got into a scuffle with the protesters at Columbia University, a night janitor.
Mm-hmm.
And he's terrified that he's going to be doxxed by the protesters. And he's like a black guy. Of course, black guys were the night janitors, maintenance staff at Hamilton Hall, and one guy, he said the other guy was big enough that he could just push his way out, but he was detained. The guy that I saw the interview with, and these are the people who vote for Trump.
Yeah,
he said, I can't, like the students are, pay tuition that's twice my salary per year. And, I take a lot of pride in my work. I'm very thankful to have this job. I'm now afraid that because I got into a scuffle with the protesters, the university might fire me.
Yeah.
Right? And he's just like, I have children. I have to support. I just want to work. I take pride in having this job. It was a good job. It was a beautiful campus. And these people who aren't even students here came in and trashed the place. And they physically got into an altercation with me when they took over the building, and they wouldn't let me out. And he was bruised and cut, and it was the 40-year-old millionaire guy who he was physically in the altercation with. It was that guy, right? And these people are going to vote for Trump. In other words, he may not have voted for Trump before that experience. After that experience, he's definitely going to be voting for Trump.
Right.
That's your result.
Even though the protesters are calling Biden Genocide Joe, you won't vote for Biden despite them.
No, because basically everyone knows what's going on.
Okay.
The left can lie about it, but everyone knows that the protesters are Democrats.
Right.
And so they know that the Democrats encourage this stuff.
Yeah.
This guy, again, black, working class person, has to support a family. He's not a BLM protester. No way. No. Right? So they know what's going on. They see this is the same. This is more of the same. It's just rioting that's encouraged by the Democrats. They see it. They know exactly what it is. Right? And, like the left can say, oh, what is it? No. Regular people know exactly what it is.
Well, I had to do that. I had to do wait. Right? I had to read and think about it and then go, oh, this is the Democrats. Working class people knew that right away. I mean, reading tablet is useful because they're going to say things that the left won't say, and I don't have to take in everything that they think.
No, of course not.
But again, it's good to know that the Tides Foundation is supporting the groups that called for the protests on campus. That's worth knowing. And what is the Tides Foundation? It's a dark money Democratic group. It's like they get the Democrats their votes. They take money from donors and wash it and get out the vote for Democrats and things like that.
What I was going to say is the left, right? So that my favorite coordinate point for the left in thinking about this is the PFLP. Since they are the left in Gaza, and they are the left in Gaza that supports Hamas. But they are the left. They're Marxist-Leninists, And they support Hamas despite ideological differences. They don't support Hamas's Islamism. They support Hamas as a national liberation movement, as the armed struggle. In other words, like, if you just want a straightforward leftist argument, go to the PFLP. Don't go to Judith Butler or whatever. Like, you don't have to do this roundabout thing or DSA Jacobin, sophistry. You can just go to the source, which is Palestinian leftists on the ground in Gaza who are fighting side by side with Hamas against Israel. And I think they might have even participated in the October 7th attacks. Right? Now, that's the left. That's the left that supports Hamas. Well, the PFLP are connected with the protest movement abroad because they're connected, they have members abroad, and they're connected to the Maoists abroad. So the Freedom Road Socialist Organization in the United States considers the PFLP to be a fraternal organization. And when the FBI raided the FRSO, the Maoists, the Freedom Road Socialists, they raided them for supporting terrorism. And who did they have in mind? The PFLP and the FARC in Colombia, who are narco-terrorists. So there is a left, and it does support terrorism as far as the government is concerned, as far as the U.S. government is concerned. And obviously I don't agree with the U.S. government on this. But, you don't need to get into weird rad lib something or other and angst about the Democrats. You can just say, okay, who are the Marxists? Who are the people who think of themselves as Marxists? Now, the FRSO in the United States basically also support the Democrats. They support the progressive Democrats. They are heavily involved in the Teamsters for a Democratic Union. This is a serious I know them personally. They're friends with Adolf Reed, right? This is the left that does in fact support Hamas. There is such a thing. It's not a slur, a slander. It's nothing. It's just true. And so it's strategic. It's political. It's strategic. You want to fight Israel, fight Zionism. Well, then you got to support Hamas. Right? And it's like, okay, so my attitude is, leaving aside the atrocities and this and that and, who did what and who killed whom, is the armed struggle the way to go? Right? How is this working out after 75 years? How's it working? How's this armed struggle working for the Palestinians? How's it working out? Is this effective? Just in its own terms, national liberation. It's not working. But also, I have to pinch myself. I'm a Marxist. I'm a socialist. Is that my battle? National liberation?
Well, let's talk about that for a second because, I read Hal Draper talking about national liberation struggles and what the traditional view of national liberation struggles are. And the traditional view is that when it comes to those struggles, even reactionary groups should be supported by Marxists because the demand for a sovereign nation by people is a democratic demand and therefore is an advance over the colonial status. To be under the thumb of imperial power, it puts you in a worse position in terms of the struggle for socialism than if you have your own sovereign nation, even if it's under the thumb of a reactionary ruling class. And that's the justification for it, to struggle for bourgeois rights, basically, in these places.
Right. That's right. So, I would just say Pache Hal Draper. Go back to Lenin. The struggle is for the self-determination of the working class. Not the national self-determination, but just the determination of the working class as such.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? It means fighting against the workers being nationally oppressed.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it would be fighting against, I don't know, the workers, the Palestinian workers working in Israel having second-class citizenship status.
Sure.
Right? So now, Marxists always think that the national bourgeoisie are going to sell out the self-determination of the people, are going to compromise, are going to sell out freedom from national oppression of the working class, right? That they're gonna have more in common with the capitalists of another nation than they have with the workers of their own nation.
Yeah.
Okay? That's a hard one for us to wrap our heads around, especially in a situation like this. But it presumes something. It presumes that there is a working class struggle. And in a working class struggle, then, of course, the national capitalists of one nation are going to find more in common with the national capitalists of another nation against their common enemy, the working class, in its struggle.
Right.
But that doesn't exist. That doesn't
Right.
exist. Right? So what we're dealing with here is, again, it's going to sound to people like just a fantasy. And it's like, but choose your fantasy. Is your fantasy genocide? Or is your fantasy worker solidarity?
Right.
Because genocide's a fantasy too. Meaning extermination is not going to happen. Even ethnic cleansing, not going to happen. I don't think. Again, of course I could be wrong, but I doubt it.
Well, I mean, once they go into Rafah, they're pushing them to the south a little bit and up, but if Egypt would let them in, I think they would be glad to just push them all into Egypt. Am I wrong about that? And wouldn't that count as ethnic cleansing?
Sure. Oh, sure, that would count as ethnic cleansing if they were kicked out and denied the ability to return. Yes, of course,
Right.
absolutely, that is ethnic cleansing. Of course it is. I don't think that's what's happening, and not only because Egypt won't have it, but because the Israelis don't need it. They don't need to do that to defeat Hamas militarily,
Right.
which is their goal.
To destroy Hamas.
Yes, you
In
use
the terms
Siegel
of Jacob
distinction.
Siegel. Yeah.
But
right.
defeat militarily, not defeat politically, ideologically. Because after all,
Right.
Hamas is abroad. The ideological leadership is outside Palestine, and they have other people on the ground in the West Bank. So, but they had a military infrastructure in Gaza that they don't have in the West Bank. And it's that military infrastructure that's being destroyed, namely the rocket launching sites, the tunnels, and the fighters.
Right.
And the weapons caches. Those things can be destroyed. They can, absolutely. In other words, they can be militarily degraded to the point of irrelevance in the West Bank. Hamas. That can be done, and it will be done. And the Israelis will do whatever it takes, take as long as it takes to do that. And they will not be stopped, and they will not stop until they do that.
Right. And so what, in Lesser, we went over some of the, alternative histories for the future already. We already, right. We already
No, I mean,
discussed.
it's just super tricky because, again, I think that people, they are in denial of reality. Meaning, I mean, this is not a good picture that I'm painting. This is a horrific picture that I'm painting.
Right.
Meaning, collateral damage, civilian, whatever. Like, this is a horror. The whole thing's a horror. Like, ever since October 7th, it's a horror. And again, the October 7th attack was a horror, but the Israeli counterattack is the horror. Like, I say, yes, the horror is the Israeli attack.
Right.
The counterattack. Like, in other words, it obviously. But when Hamas launched this attack, they wanted this outcome.
Right. Maybe not
So
quite
let's
on this scale, but they wanted
maybe,
this
but maybe not. In other words, that's beside the point. They certainly knew that Israel was going to kill many more Palestinians than Israelis were killed.
Oh, yeah.
They certainly knew that, because that's been true every time.
Right.
So it is a deliberate, calculated choice on Hamas's part. that the people of Gaza have to suffer the consequences for. And I'm on the side of the people of Gaza who have to suffer for the consequences of Hamas and Israel. Meaning they are the ones who are suffering the choices made by Israel and by Hamas. That's it, and so, I mean, it's not to say, because I know that people will object. They'll say, oh, well, working class people are willing to sacrifice for the national liberation struggle. Maybe some of them are. Maybe some of them are. Maybe a great deal of them are. But there will be people who will survive. And they will work.
Right. I mean, there were working class people who are willing to die in Vietnam for the United States.
For the United States, yeah.
Right.
I mean,
yeah.
I mean, obviously, it's different, I guess. I mean, obviously, conscripts, like you were drafted. I mean, Vietnam is a draft. Now it's a volunteer army, but it's a poverty draft.
Right.
Meaning there are many people who don't have a choice really but to join the military, including in my own family.
But you're saying that what the claim is that the people of Gaza are ideologically committed, that they really want to take it to the Israelis, and that they, unlike the
left thinks so. I'm not so sure. Meaning, I think, again, the idea that this is a spontaneous uprising by the people of Gaza, no, not really. And also the idea that the people of Gaza are willing to die a noble death, no. Again, we have to sort of catch ourselves and wonder, whose fantasy is that? Right.
Well, this is what I want to kind of get at. This is the thing that I've kind of been coming back around to, and that people should get out of, they should read your piece in Sublation magazine because it's important. But what I want to tell Marxists, people who are in my own milieu, people like Donald Parkinson and others, is that you should take note that when people like myself said at the beginning, this is going to be nothing more than a movement to change the Democratic Party, and we're just going to path back to the Democratic Party at a moment where there was at least the beginning of a glimmer that we might have to develop an independent politics, and this is a way not to do that. That now these same people are claiming that they're politically serious because of their involvement in the uncommitted movement, right? That they're serious Marxists struggling against imperialism because of a movement that's trying to put a line item into a primary in New Jersey that's already defunct as a slight pressure tactic on a candidate who is already.
But maybe they also are willing to have Trump be elected to punish the Democrats for being too pro-Israel.
Yeah, but the uncommitted movement is not. I mean, explicitly is not. I mean, it's explicitly targeting a primary and not the general, right? So, it's just below that. But even let's say you're willing to get Trump elected, nonetheless, that is a little less clear. But I mean, with this, it's very clear. This is an intra-party conflict. It's a pretend.
So my favorite, by the way, Doug Henwood, I saw tweeted in response to Biden's speech against anti-Semitism, where Biden accused Hamas of anti-Semitism and accused Hamas of like ancient hatred against the Jews, participating in ancient hatred against the Jews. And Doug Henwood was like, that's the worst line ever spoken by a U.S. president. And I was like, well, it's probably just true. I mean, I guess the idea is that, I don't know, European anti-Semitism is different from Islamic anti-Semitism or something. In other words, that you can complain about white people being anti-Semitic, but you can't complain about brown people being anti-Semitic. Maybe it's something like that. And I just thought, well, come on. And so obviously there's a great deal of disaffection with Biden. And I think that even to the point where they're willing to depress the vote for Biden.
Right. No, I think that's true. But that is, Yeah, but that is not a path away
The
from the Democratic Party.
political. Oh, it's not a path to the No, it's not a path away from the Democratic Party. Of course not. It's a path for reforming the Democratic Party. It's like the Greens.
Mhm.
You know, the idea is that you're going to punish the Democrats in order to force them to change.
Right.
And, you know, that doesn't really happen. That has never happened. And, you know, it's not going to happen. So I think, I mean, it could very well be that people wake up and are like, oh, we have to stop fascism, stop Trump ahead of the November election. Maybe. That's not going to change the outcome of the election. Like, as you mentioned earlier, I don't think this is going to be particularly decisive. I mean, it could be that in some states like Wisconsin and Michigan, where there's a sizable Muslim population, or maybe even Minnesota, you know, that, you know, some swing states might be affected because of depressed turnout among Muslim Americans. Possibly. But other than that, I mean, obviously in a state like New York or in a state like Oregon or in a state like California, it makes no difference whatsoever.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mentioned the janitor who will vote for Trump. That's not going to change anything. But if you just want to know, like, the blacks and Latinos who are going to vote for Trump, right, it's not like Palestine is going to stop them from voting for Trump. No.
The other, I guess, final questions, we should look ahead and say, what will the consequence of Trump being elected be?
For the left. Yeah, I mean, for the left. Okay, so I think that if Biden is reelected, then we can expect to see more of this kind of left, rad lib and Stalinist left, anti-imperialist left. Let's recall the Trump years. There were no protests. Not really. Not until BLM.
Well, no, there was the Pussy Hat Women's March.
There was the march. That was early on, though, right?
Yeah.
Very early on. And also...
And there were protests about the immigration policies and the occupation of airports.
Oh, yes, there was that. There was some airport protests. I was also going to say there was Charlottesville, of course. There was Antifa.
You're right. Well, there was Antifa throughout.
Or Antifa. But really, you know, you're seeing more protests now under Biden. And I don't think that will... I mean, I guess it could escalate. It could be like Nixon coming in 68, and the Kent State shooting happened under Nixon, you know, when Nixon invaded Cambodia. But Trump's not going to do that, I don't think. I mean, obviously, there are all sorts of things that can happen, but I think that generally speaking, now, the Israelis might be holding out for Trump to be elected.
Yeah.
They might be. Right? And so the protesters protesting against Biden are actually making it more difficult for the U.S. to pressure Israel. That's the other ironic aspect. In other words, they may not care whether Trump's elected or not. You know, they might say they don't care. Of course they care. But in the meantime, actually, Israel might be holding out for Trump. They might be. I don't know.
I know Tablet is pro-Trump. You know,
they might think that Trump's easier to manipulate than Biden. You know, I think that Trump might have a better chance at twisting Israel's arm than Biden in some ways, perhaps, through some multilateralism in the Middle East, perhaps, maybe. I certainly don't think that it's just a straightforward thing, you know, like, oh, you know, Biden's a little bit critical of Israel, but just enough to give them ideological cover, whereas Trump's full-throated pro-Zionist, blah, blah, blah. I don't think that it's like that, surely. But we can say that weakening Biden helps Trump, and the likelihood of Trump's election might be an incentive for Israel to hold out and continue.
Yeah.
Right?
Mhm.
So that's, in other words, why does Israel turn down the CIA director's draft treaty or agreement, ceasefire arrangement? Because they're like, actually, we might get a better deal with Trump.
Mhm.
Right?
That might be, yeah.
Right? Whereas if they knew they were going to be dealing with this people after November, they might be more susceptible to pressure. They might be. I actually think, however, that there might be delaying tactics, playing games, but I think that Israel, I do think they've made a commitment to destroy Hamas militarily, and I think it's within their capability to do so. And it might take a long time, might involve a lot of death and destruction, more so than now already.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I think they're doing that. I think that's it, and no amount of protests are going to change anything.
Do you think there's any hope for the Marxist left that remains to catch wise to its own strategy backfiring and try something else? And there are some.
Look, my view is, of course, the left is dead. There is no Marxist left. So my sense is, what is this about? It's about a kind of teachable moment, and it's about ideological, proselytization. Meaning, what does the left do around these kinds of issues? Like, if there is, a Marxist left participating in these campus protests, to any extent, what is their goal? Their goal is to recruit.
Right.
Right? And to my mind, that means recruiting to pseudo-Marxism, not Marxism.
Mm-hmm.
I will kind of maintain that. It's a miseducation. But that's why they're there. That's why they're doing this. That's what they think it's all about.
Why can't they recruit to that? Why can't they go to the protest and say, listen, this is misguided. All of this is leading you into the Democratic Party. If you're concerned about changing conditions enough to actually overcome imperialism, you need to step back from this. Why can't they go and...
Oh, they can't do that because, first of all, they would have to be real Marxists to do that. And they're not.
Right. Okay. Right.
And also, we're seeing a continuation of the left that you and I saw as young people back in the 80s and 90s.
Right.
Which is that these groups have a long-term strategy that's rather cynical, meaning they know that they keep themselves going by recruiting 100 students in order to keep 3. That's how they keep their tendencies going over the decades. So they're super cynical about it. In other words, are they really trying to grow the movement? No. Are they even trying to grow their own organizations? No. They're just trying to maintain them at base, on life support, baseline level. The largest organization on the left before the DSA bump was the ISO, and they're gone. So these organizations can disappear. They can go under. They are vulnerable to that, and they have to recruit to survive. That's why they're there. That's the only reason why they're at anything, ever. And they need to recruit, very directly, in other words, it can't be this kind of loose kind of thing, like Platypus is very loose, and we can keep ourselves going. These groups can't keep themselves going that way. They have to be very hardcore with their recruiting, and so they have to really ideologically recruit.
What? No, why? Why can't they do it the other way?
Oh, because they need their members to pay a tithe.
Oh.
They have full-time staff whose salaries are paid by the other members who pay a sizable percentage of their income to the organization.
Oh.
Yeah, that's how these organizations function. And of course, Platypus doesn't have money, doesn't need money. We do everything for free, basically. And so therefore, we get some campus funds from schools as campus student groups, and that's it. We collect nominal dues for psychological reasons and to pay for shipments of the Platypus Review to our campus chapters. So
Right.
students basically pay the postage on the Platypus Review that's mailed to them every month.
Right.
But we otherwise, and if that got to be too much of a headache, we do away with that, because my motto with Platypus is we should do this without needing any money. Without needing any money.
And you're not looking to keep Platypus around for 100 years necessarily.
Not necessarily, but maybe we need to survive World War III in the end. I mean, so if there's any hope for humanity to survive, but no, we're just, it's a different model. The Marxist left that you and I have encountered our whole lives, they have a particular model, and in order for that model to work, they do have to recruit or perish. And in order to recruit in a long-term sense, they have to recruit a lot of people that they know they'll lose. And so they just intersect these rad lib issues, and they know that at the end of the day, most of the people that they're attracting are not going to be around. It's very cynical, super cynical, super cynical. Whereas I feel like everyone who's ever heard a word that I've ever said, I desperately want to be an actual socialist Marxist, like a real, please do it. Like, in other words, I'm not like, oh, I don't care if only 1 out of 1,000 people listen to me. Children out there, I really want you to be Marxists and actual socialists. Please don't be rad lib, Democrats. Please, we want socialism. We want socialism, please. Right? So this rad lib stuff is here today, gone tomorrow, here this year, gone next year. Please commit yourself more long term to the actual
here today, gone tomorrow, here again, gone tomorrow, here again.
Right. Yeah. No, but we need people to be serious and to make a commitment that they can sustain over a very long period of time. Don't get burned out. Don't throw your youth away on this kind of AstroTurf protesting.
That's a great ending line. I'm going to stop the recording there. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.